Good evening, I'm your host, Nate, and you are listening to the Nightwatch. Pull up a chair, get as comfortable as possible, because tonight the topic is a little uncomfortable. In fact, you might say it's a bit disturbing. But that's how the history of humanity usually is, isn't it? It's not always a perfect picture. Shall we begin? Okay. No bullshit. This is a heavy topic. So while I was researching this project, I couldn't help at times but become emotionally invested. Especially when I was reading about some of the personal accounts of the people whose lives had been directly affected by unimaginable suffering. The young couple who were just engaged. For all they knew, their lives were still ahead of them. At least, in that moment, they were in love, and they were going to live out all their days together. But they never grew old, their lives taken by an unseen enemy, where whole families were struck with the illness and unable to care for each other. Children would be found dead in their rooms, without their parents even being aware. The bodies of the deceased stacked up like cordwood. Children playing out on the streets, climbing over boxes, unaware of the fact that they were coffins and they weren't empty. How transient life is. There's always something a little off about us, isn't there? Like some inherent flaw. A genetic predisposition, you might even say. And in society as a whole, there's always an underbelly, an unseen world, aspects of ourselves that we'd rather keep hidden. Humanity is always struggling with its own humanity. And I think on some psychological, emotional, even spiritual level, the consequences of others' actions trickle down through time. And in some way, even though it may be imperceptible, leaves a scar, leaves a stain, leaves an imprint on us somehow, from the choices made from those who came before us. We are a product of our human history. We're all part of the same flawed species. We all share the same faults. We all have the same weaknesses. We just exist in a different time frame. I don't mean this to scare away the squeamish, but history is often not a pleasant thing to look at. Every frame, every major event in the history of mankind is not a romantic era painting. Some angles look a bit more frightening and surreal. Other frames of our history look a bit more abstract, a little harder to decipher at first glance. Often people's true motives are a little tricky to decipher, aren't they? Even in real time, let alone the multicolored kaleidoscope of history. I thought there'd be no better topic than the Spanish flu of 1918 to kind of send off my new podcast on its maiden voyage, you could say. Seems how we're in the midst of what officials are labeling a pandemic. And just for the record, it's early May 2020. So with no further ado, let's dive into the gruesome details. So to begin with, the Spanish flu was coined the Spanish flu because Spain was a neutral country during the Great War, the First World War. The war also coined as the war to end all wars, if only that were the case. So whereas other countries who were actively involved in the war had tighter restrictions on the reporting from the press, Spain did not. So when people began contracting the sickness and began dying, and as the rest of the world began reading the reports, it appeared as if it had originated in Spain. And as for the exact origin of the Spanish flu, your guess is as good as mine. I believe the Spanish blamed it on the French, and the Germans blamed the Chinese, who had experienced the bubonic plague in 1910. But probably the most commonly accepted version of the not-so-nice fairy tale story of the origins of the Spanish flu is that it first appeared in early March 1918 in central Kansas, Haskell County, at Camp Funston, now Fort Riley, according to historian Alfred Crosby. On March 11th, 1918, an Army private reported to the camp hospital with symptoms of fever, sore throat, headache. It is said that by noon, over 100 more other soldiers had shown up with the same symptoms, and within a week, there had been 500. And that spring, 48 soldiers had died. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but just as soon as the illness had appeared, it had mysteriously vanished. And over summer and fall, over 1.5 million Americans had crossed the Atlantic to go to war. Some of those soldiers came from Kansas. January 1918, the world was still in the grip of the Great War, a global conflict on an unprecedented scale that had led to the death of some 38 million people. And while the war still raged, along came the Spanish flu outbreak that would ultimately inflict higher casualties than the war itself. 10 to 20% of those infected died. As many as 25 million are believed to have perished within just the first 25 weeks. And given the censorship of wartime countries, lack of accurate records, and inaccurate death certificates, the total of global mortalities may be even higher. In 1918, mass troop movements spread Spanish flu among the military, while bond drives aimed at persuading citizens to contribute to the war effort and victory parades in the United States dispersed influenza among the civilian population. The end of the war did not bring an end to the Spanish flu, as death rates soared. The joyful crowds gathered to welcome the armistice in Albert Square, Manchester, unwittingly inviting the Spanish lady to join them, and the killer virus remained active well into 1919. The most terrifying aspects of the Spanish flu, in addition to its frightening transmission rate, were its horrifying symptoms. By comparison, a conventional case of the flu, the victim incubates the virus for at least 24 hours and up to 4 to 5 days before the disease becomes obvious. First signs are headache, chills, dry cough, fever, weakness, and loss of appetite. Generalized fatigue and in some bronchitis and pneumonia ensue. Recovery to full strength following the flu may take several weeks or longer. What can confuse the matter is that although influenza is a distinct and recognizable clinical entity, many patients and some physicians tend to group most respiratory ailments under a blanket of the flu. For most of us, a case of the flu means little more than a few days off work. But the Spanish flu, by contrast, was far more aggressive and fast-acting. During the devastating second wave of the epidemic, which began in the summer of 1918, victims collapsed in the street, hemorrhaging from the lungs and nose. Their skin turned dark blue with the characteristic heliotrope cyanosis caused by oxygen failure as their lungs filled with pus, and they gasped for air, almost like fish out of water. Those who died quickly were the lucky ones. Others suffered projectile vomiting and explosive diarrhea, and died raving as their brains were starved of oxygen. Those who recovered were often left with a lifetime's legacy of nervous conditions, lethargy, and depression. Doctors and nurses worked heroically to care for the sick, often falling ill themselves. On the battlefield, both Allies and Germans sustained massive losses. Out of the 100,000 casualties suffered by the United States military, 40,000 troops died from the Spanish flu. And as troop movements dispersed influenza to every corner of the globe, the Spanish lady traveled alongside innocent doughboys. From the United States to France, on one such journey, the doomed voyage of the USS Leviathan in September 1918, over 96 men succumbed to the Spanish flu in hellish conditions. Entire families were struck down in their homes. Children starved to death as their parents lay helpless in their beds. Deranged men murdered their children, convinced that their offspring would starve without them. In South Africa, the bodies of the dead and dying mine workers were thrown from trains and left alongside the tracks. In New York, 600 children ended up in orphanages. Across the globe, entire cities became ghost towns as daily life ground to a halt. In Washington and Cape Town, undertakers ran out of coffins, while in Philadelphia, a shortage of burial space meant the city council resorted to excavating mass graves with steam shovels. As the specter of the Spanish lady conjured up visions, or more like nightmares, of the Black Death of 1348, some speculated that this was not influenza at all, but a reemergence of the plague itself. And a kind of apocalyptic fear gripped some people who felt as if the human race might face extinction. And as the American epidemiologist Dr. Victor C. Vaughan pointed out in 1918, the doctors of the day, quote, knew no more about the flu than 14th century Florentines had known about the Black Death. Another disturbing feature of the Spanish flu was the age of the casualties. Normally, it is the very young and the very old, and patients with compromised immune systems who are most susceptible to dying from influenza. But the majority of the victims in the Spanish flu epidemic were healthy young men and women, wiped out in their prime. Pregnant women were particularly vulnerable. In Massachusetts, one midwife helped a young woman deliver her premature baby, only to have both die within hours of one another. Between spring of 1918 and the summer of 1919, the Spanish lady continued her dance of death and destruction. Apart from the Spanish lady herself, the most distinctive image of the Spanish flu is the mask. While the mask itself provided little protection from the disease, it has kind of become an icon of this period. Generally white and fastened behind the head, the mask graduated from medical staff to the civilian population. In many towns and cities, it became an offense to go outside without one. Sound familiar? Policemen directed traffic in masks. Entire family groups were photographed in their masks, including their cats and dogs. A honeymooning couple in San Francisco shyly confessed to their doctor that they wore their masks and nothing else when making love. Death is a topic that few people want to think about, let alone look death in the face. While I record this message, a family pet, an old cat of ours, is laying there, unresponsive, yet still breathing. And a month or so ago, while compiling these ideas for this podcast, another family pet died through the night. And a few weeks ago, I was sorry to hear an old friend of mine finally lost her mother. But at least she did live to a ripe old age, and that's as much as we all can hope for. Although my experience pales in comparison to some of the ways in which lives were affected by the Spanish flu. And I can only imagine what some of these people went through, losing multiple loved ones and close friends in such a short period of time. Just the thought of having to wrap a dead loved one and keep them stored in another room. And meanwhile, life still goes on. Death is something we make believe doesn't exist. Something we pretend that isn't real, or something that'll never apply to us until we have to face it. And the modern world does keep us pretty sanitized. When death does arise, it is dealt with quickly, and dead bodies are whisked away to a morgue, where the dead are quickly prepared, either for burial or cremation. Either way, the dead are kept carefully and respectfully out of sight. And we do pretty good at sheltering ourselves from the grief that comes along with the realization that life is temporal and death is a reality of life, and it's something we all face, whether we want to or not. Death is by definition the absence of life, and science can only explain the processes of what makes life, what life subsists of in the physical world. And medical science mostly deals with the processes that are destructive to life. Sickness and disease, or in this case, pandemic. And faith kind of steps in, you might say, to fill in the blank, to answer the questions that we're left with, that science has no answers for. Scientific studies have found religion can serve as a very powerful psychological coping mechanism when people are faced with an overwhelming sense of grief, hopelessness, and helplessness. The people of 100 years ago lived in a society in which religious beliefs were deeply embedded, and most looked to their religion for an explanation of the catastrophe that had ravaged their communities. And people are often at their most religious when their lives and their livelihoods are under serious threat. I like how one Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town, South Africa, put it. People speak of the flu pandemic, as an act of God, but it seems to me to put the matter into an altogether wrong light. The enemy who sows terrors certainly found a congenial soil in the slums here. The epidemic's devastation lay in the fact that certain conditions laid down by the Creator as necessary to our health have been neglected, willfully it may be, or what it is more likely, in ignorance. We know already that fresh air, cleanliness, nourishment are our allies in contending with disease, and that, on the other hand, foul air, dirt, poor and insufficient food are enemies strongly entrenched in the households of thousands of people in this country. We who tolerate such conditions are guilty before God and humanity. From what I've read, people of 100 years ago had a lot more faith than this modern secular age. So I wonder if we are faced with a real pandemic, if we are seeing one unfold in front of us, the likes of the Spanish flu, as some experts have suggested. I wonder if we have the spiritual fortitude to withstand the kind of mental anguish that you would have to endure seeing so many dead and dying people. It seems you would almost have to have a greater faith than what you see in the suffering, in the hopelessness that surrounds you in such a dire, dark hour. Or as it says in Revelation 6:17, "For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" Even if we are to trust the numbers from, let's just say politely, less than reputable sources, right now, we are just looking at only a fraction of what a real pandemic like the Spanish flu would look like. As I check the numbers now, the reported deaths of the current quote-unquote pandemic stand at just over 300,000 worldwide. Modern estimates of the Spanish flu death toll, somewhere between 50 million and 100 million people ultimately died worldwide, 500,000 just here in the US. So we've yet to see anything remotely close to a real pandemic. And despite some expert warnings that we're long due for another mass pandemic on the scale of a 1918 influenza, we've been pretty sheltered from anything remotely close to the kind of trauma that those that came before us experienced up close and personal. While looking through old photographs of the pandemic, I was struck by this eerily familiar feeling. There is a kind of haunting familiarity with the world we've found ourselves in. It's like looking at an old picture of a distant relative you've never met in life, but you can still identify some shared likeness or a common physical characteristic, as if we're looking in a mirror at the world we've inherited, the new reality that has been remanifest. Have you ever thought that we are so connected to the past that, in a sense, our past restricts our movement in the present? Maybe even, to some degree, smothers us. A kind of ripple that is now repeating in time. A snapshot of our shared human experience. Do you ever feel connected to the past in a way that we can't escape it? There's a word for that. Predestination. I can't say I believe 100% that our lives are predestined, but in a sense, we are confined to our human experience. We are confined to this planet in space. The same forces of nature are ultimately working against us. just as they worked on our predecessors. The laws of physics, science of biology, our own mortality, and by these pesky little viruses that threaten to cause our extinction. All these little things that work against our hopes and dreams. We are finite and fragile little life forms. There is a shared humility in humanity, and in a moment, our lives can be drastically changed. Despite all of our hopes and dreams, despite all of our ambitious plans, everything can be cut short all too quickly by an invisible foe. While reading through people's stories and looking through the black and white photographs of men and women with faces covered by masks, almost becomes too familiar to the present, and it almost seems as if by some freak of nature, history is reliving itself, and the nightmares of old have woken up again. I just wanted to thank everybody for taking the time to watch, listen to my first podcast. I hope it stimulated some thought, brought some of the human experience from our history, our shared history, to life. Maybe got you to think down different roads, different courses, different paths than what you're used to. That's what I would hope for anyway. It was quite an ordeal. It was quite a process. I'll tell you that much. I have a lot more to come in the next episode. Should be just piling on the layers of depth of meaning, and hopefully we can continue to learn from our history and kind of put the pieces together like that. I'm just trying to posit ideas, learn from the past, know where we stand, and toss out potential scenarios where we're headed. So it's a fun journey. I invite everybody to join me for the next podcast. And like they always say, share, like, subscribe. That really does help out independent creators like myself, because that's the only way we can get recognition. Thankfully, we still live in a free enough world, free enough society, free enough country that we can have the time to set aside to educate ourselves and think deeper about why the world is the way it is, and possible outcomes and possible courses we could even take as a people to make maybe even the world a better place, maybe even write a new history on into the future. So, just some ideas. Thanks for everybody for listening. Appreciate everybody out there, and it makes it all worthwhile, even if I get a handful of people who take the time to watch and listen to what I've created. It's like a conversation. People that know me, this is what I do anyway. I speculate endlessly and see things from angles that some people might not constantly running scenarios through my mind, so it's just natural, I guess. Thanks everybody for watching once again, and stay safe out there. God bless. We'll see you.